This is American Government for Friday, November 12th, Part B. The reason that there's a Part B and a Part A is I accidentally clicked the stop button when I was recording this lecture, so I accidentally created a Part A, and this is Part B. Where are we right now? I just finished talking about the first criticism of the contemporary presidency, that the president has grown too powerful, has become imperial, transcended, and escaped from the constitutional system. And to summarize my argument, both on the notes and what I was saying in Part A, is that the president, I think, still is responsible to the electorate through the presidential election, and that the president is not actually extra constitutional because the system of checks and balances and separation of powers, both from the legislative branch and the judicial branch, and also even from the federal system, because after all, the suit in the Fifth Circuit Court, federal courts, that put a hold on President Biden's vaccine mandates for private companies over 100. That was actually joined, I think, by 15 attorneys general and a couple of governors of several different states. So you'd have to say the constitutional system means that the president's powers, broad and expansive as they are not unchecked. The separation of powers and checks and balances on the national level, and the division between national and state authority on the federal level still restrains the power of the president. The second criticism, which is and that's what I just begun to talk about, is the president too weak? That is to say, have the expectations and tasks of the president exceeded the constitutional powers of the president so that the job is beyond any one person? And when we look at the rest of these notes, when we look at the chartograph, you'll see this massive federal bureaucracy, not just in terms of size and scope and institutions, but also, as you're going to see, there is a certain sense in which the civil service system, which we'll discuss when we come to the bureaucracy in Wilson Chapter 11 at the end of this video, suggests that perhaps the president doesn't have enough power constitutionally to actually do the constitutional expectations or public expectations that we put on him. So in the middle of page 6, I suggest that in some ways and Wilson almost partially suggests that in Chapter 10 when he talks about the skimpy powers, constitutional powers of the president. I think the answer to this criticism is it depends on the president. Certain individuals seem to be more competent in the presidency than others, and to some degree, it may be a combination of circumstances, of character and abilities, but also in terms of the relationships. Do you remember the 4 kinds of leadership that we talked about in Part A of this lecture? That Kennedy's campaign speech on the presidency, the 4 kinds of leadership. Part of the president's ability to lead the Constitution and do his constitutional tasks, or her constitutional tasks, may be the extent to which he or she is a successful party leader. So I think that the unity of the president, and this is my conclusion in the middle of page 6, is an answer to the question of whether the job has escaped. There's no question. In some ways, the presidency is probably the most complicated executive position in the world. But whether or not it's beyond the powers of the presidency may be answerable by the question of the powers of the individual that holds the office. And last, this is the criticism raised. And by the way, on the notes on page 5, I also discuss Kevin Burns' article in the Nichols Reader, Nichols 48, which also supports the notion that the presidency has full scope of action within the constitutional system. That's the Burns article. So to come back then to the Caesar et al. Article, The Rise of the Rhetorical President. As I said earlier, we now have a president. This is the bottom of page 6 and the top of page 7 of the notes. We have essentially a popular means of electing and nominating the president, as we saw, where candidates in extensive binding primaries now compete for popular followings to get elected. In The Rise of the Rhetorical President, Caesar, etc., argues that this combination with the growth of the media has made the president too dependent on a popular following generated through cheerleading to govern. And it's very easy for popular opinion to chafe against constitutional limitations. That means in almost all constitutional democracies in the 19th and 20th and 21st century that have been overthrown by powerful dictators, almost all of them, going back to, in some ways, in the 20th century, Adolf Hitler, who was democratically elected through the party system and the parliamentary system in Germany in 1932 and 33, and within 1 year, based on his mastery of the Nazi Party, but also his ability as a kind of a popular dictator to assert his power against the Weimar Constitution, overthrew the Constitution. And so the idea that a powerful executive can use popularity to overthrow the constitutional system it's not an idle speculation. It has happened, and it may be that the popular executive, the popular opinion-based executive, may be in fact one of the major threats to the constitutional system. Can the presidency, this is in the middle of page 7, the way I put the question, can the presidency become a threat to the Constitution? And Lincoln does suggest, remember, the president who in our history probably stretched the powers of the presidency, given the Civil War, more than anyone else. The task is the president to kind of summon popular opinion, but to remain within the constitutional system, as Burns raises that question. And I would say that is a concern, and especially with popular media and in some ways the internet and social media, the idea that the president, there are two problems with the popular president. One, that the presidency the president may actually be so popular that he or she can overthrow the constitutional system by appealing directly to the people. The other problem is that, as you know, public opinion polls changes and rapidly, and it may be that if the president loses popularity, the president won't have enough popular support to even maintain his or her constitutional tasks. So in addition to the problem of either creating a president that can't be contained by the constitutional system because institutional authority has been reduced to popular authority, the problem is the president may so raise expectations by cheerleading rhetoric that it leads to a kind of a profound inability to do his or her job. And moreover, like any other kind of advertising that overpromises and then when it can't deliver, that generates a kind of cynicism. And even though I'm not hawking patriotism, but I do think that a nation that has become cynical about the ability of its governing system to deliver good government may be a problem over the long run. And so Caesar and the other authors argue that this constant resort to popular cheerleading to get the president's programs and popularity up may actually lead to an undermining of confidence in government. So those are the problems and the kinds of criticisms that people lodge against the presidency. The presidency is too strong, the imperial presidency, that the presidency is too weak, the job's too big for any one person, and that the president and presidential authority has now been refounded, dangerously perhaps, on popular direct authority. So if you're looking at the notes, this is now page 7. We're going to discuss the subject of Wilson Chapter 11, which is the larger executive branch, commonly called the bureaucracy. Now, by the way, the word bureaucracy is it's a French word, actually. You know, the cracy part, like democracy, aristocracy, comes from the Greek word kratia, which means to rule. So the cracy part means rule of. In bureau is the French word for office. So bureaucracy means the rule of the administrators, of the bureaucrats, of the people, the faceless people in government offices. And Wilson has a nice discussion of the mixed feelings that Americans have about the bureaucracy. We complain about red tape. We complain about governmental complexity and popular and not being responsible to elected officials because the scope of government is so complex and the administration is complex that you can't actually oversee it. And that's part of what Wilson describes as the love-hate relationship with the largest part of the federal government. And what's that love-hate relationship? Many Americans want to expand the size, scope, and power of the administrative component of government. President Biden, for instance, has recommended in his reconciliation bill, the Build Back Better bill, to add another $80 billion to the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, so as to generate more revenue lost by non-compliance with tax statutes, including an expansion of the number and scope of the IRS. At one point, it's not clear that this is even going to survive in the final bill, no matter what. To have the IRS, to have banks report to the IRS every transaction and account that's over $600, which means that the IRS would be examining the bank accounts and transactions of almost every American on a daily basis. So people are afraid of the expansion of the kind of impersonal and scope of the bureaucracy. On the other hand, they want often government to do more, which often means then, therefore, expanding the size, scope, and power of the bureaucracy. So what is it? Do you want more government or less government? Do you want to expand that part of government that is least amenable or susceptible to popular control? And I don't. You're going to see. I think that people both on the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans, have often demonstrate this mixed feeling, this love-hate. So what bureaucracy means in our context is the bulk of the executive branch below the political top, roughly the 2% at the top. When you look at the chartograph of the executive branch, which if you want to look at, we'll come back to this diagram, so you should have that in front of you. At the top of that pyramid, that many-layered pyramid, of course, is P. It doesn't stand for Pulvorti, thank God. It stands for the presidency. And in chapter 10 and 11, when I was talking, and in the last several lectures when I talked about the growth of the institutional size and complexity of the executive branch, and I'm just talking now about the top part. Do you see where it says WHO? It doesn't mean World Health Organization. It means White House office and the executive office of the president. And you'll see that in the 20th century, these layers of offices right under the presidency and in the White House were added to the institutional presidency so as to help the president govern this giant hydra or octopus of the federal bureaucracy. And the executive office of the president has some important offices which actually are important to the governance of the country, especially two of them if you're looking on the chartograph to the side, which are described by Wilson in both chapter 10 and 11, the NSC, the National Security Council, and the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. These were the National Security Council goes back to World War II when we became a world power. Actually, we became a world power in World War I, but with the end of World War II and the defeat of the major powers in Europe, etc., and with the creation of the UN, we became the world's superpower, of course, with the Soviet Union during the Cold War and all that. So the National Security Council is a combination of the National Security Officer plus the heads of the Department of Defense and State, to kind of help the president formulate national security and foreign and war policy. The Office of Management and Budget was actually created or reformulated in 1972 under President Nixon, and an expanded version of what was called the Bureau of the Budget, which goes back to 1921 when the Budgetary Act of 1921 required that the president submit an annual budget, which, interestingly enough, the idea of budgeting, which hasn't exactly worked out for both Congress or the president, since we have we're operating at about $1.5 trillion annual deficit now, and as I've pointed out in class several times, we've accumulated about $30 trillion in accumulated federal debt. Nevertheless, the Constitution gives the power to appropriate money and to tax and spend to Congress, but it doesn't require the Congress or the president to create a budget. But in 1921, Congress passed an act which required the president to formulate and submit an annual budget to Congress. And it created the Bureau of the Budget to help the president see spending priorities and actually keep account of spending in the executive branch. In 1972, that was expanded and formalized as the Office of Management and Budget. And that is an important office that helps the president formulate economic policy and to supervise the spending and actions of the executive branch underneath him. Now, if you're looking at the chartograph, let's just deal with this. The other top, going back to what I call political appointees at the top, which are actually what that means is, and then we'll discuss the civil service system in a minute. If you're looking on the left side of the chartograph, there are the independent regulatory agencies, like the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Reserve, which is actually the Bank of the United States, the Federal Aviation Administrator that supervises our airports. These are actually technically not part of the executive branch, although they are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, but they are partially independent. They often have terms that stagger, like 7-year terms, to create a certain kind of... So they have certain executive responsibilities, and the president appoints them, but they're not simply under the president's authority. Now, let's then talk about the rest of that pyramid, the rest of the executive branch. It's divisible into two broad categories. You see political appointees, and that, as I put in my notes, let's go back to the notes now, that's about 2 to 3% of the executive branch. Those are people that the president appoints with the advice and consent of the Senate, like the secretaries of the 14 executive departments, the undersecretaries, and it goes several layers of administration down. The president appoints those, generally speaking, on party or partisan basis, and that top 2 to 3% changes every time there's a change of administration or party. So because the president appoints and can fire those individuals for political, partisan, party reasons, that's why the top part of the executive branch changes when a different president comes in or a new party comes in. Those are called political appointees because they are appointed for political and suspended for political reasons. So if you're looking at the notes again on page 8, what I'm explaining right now is what we mean by bureaucracy. And again, the rule of offices. That means the bulk of the executive branch below the political top. That's what I just explained. Headed by the president and his or her appointees. And that's what I just referred to in the chartograph and the independent regulatory agencies. By the way, the state governments, the governments of the states in their executive branches now imitate roughly the same kind of construction and an unfolding and an operation as the federal bureaucracy. About bureaucracy and why people complain about it, and yet why it's necessary. If you're looking in the notes on the top of page 8, all complex and extensive modern governments in history, and all modern governments, this, by the way, goes back to Rome, Imperial Rome, which had an emperor, a chief executive, if you will, but even Alexander, all great extensive governments have had these complex structures of offices that perform the functions of government. And all modern governments, which we remember in the modern age, since the 18th and 19th and 20th century and 21st century, we expect government to do a lot. And therefore, all modern governments have a structure of bureaucracy which execute the actual functions of government. And these have to be large and complex because that's the only way you can create a massive governmental structure that does many things. Because you want the government to do those many things and you want them to do them well. Now, whether or not they do them well is a different question. And in the long paragraph on page 8, I repeat the etymology, the word roots of bureaucracy. It comes from French bureau and cracy, which I explained. And so bureaucracy means the rule of the offices or rule by officers. And there was a German sociologist and political scientist, mostly sociologist, Max Weber, who in the early 20th century wrote a classic essay on bureaucracy, which explains how it works and what a bureaucracy is. And if you're looking in the middle of that paragraph, essentially a complex hierarchical organization with legally defined functions, staffed and run by experts who specialize in their particular area of policy, controlled, supposedly, we'll come back to that in a minute, by the political parts of the regime or government. Weber thought that there were many advantages to bureaucratic government. He also, but in the sense that if you want somebody to if you want the government to build roads and bridges, then you probably need some part of the government that's staffed by engineers. You don't want political science professors who bark like dogs and suddenly sing in class. You wouldn't appoint me to build a bridge. Or if you did, I probably wouldn't want to drive on the bridge that I myself built, because I don't possess that expertise. So Weber thought the great thing about bureaucracy was like an army, with infantry and higher officers, where you have a command centralized as you go up the pyramid of authority, but then you also have it divided by expertise and function. So the clerk who works in the IRS and does tax returns becomes good at that, an expert. You hire an accountant to do that anyway, so you're looking for expertise. And so that's why he thought bureaucracy may be the most rational form of government. But he also thought there were many disadvantages to bureaucracy. Intrinsic pathologies that Wilson has enough nice discussion on pages 234 to 235. And that ultimately bureaucratic government becomes so complex and detached and so specialized that it loses track of the whole big picture or accountability to the people. Now, in our system of government, we hope that the single popularly elected president with his constitutional functions, also, don't forget the committee structure of Congress, which oversees the bureaucracy. We hope that this complex organization of now millions of civil servants can be overseen and directed by the political branches. But again, a lot of people get frustrated. I mean, after all, maybe you've had Converse University is not that big. It used to be Converse College before this last year, but probably you might get frustrated by having to go from office to office and dealing with what we call red tape. So even if bureaucracy has certain advantages, to go back to the main point, Americans are often both repelled by the complexity and obscurity of bureaucratic government, and yet often want the government to do more. So basically, the framers' view was, and this is what Hamilton says at the beginning of Federalist 70, number 40 in the Nichols Reader, that good execution or administration often defines a good government. And so they hoped that that's what the energetic executive, the president, would ensure by standing atop like a general overneath the executive branch. So I talk about the constitutional context of our bureaucracy. First of all, there's federalism and the enumerated and limited powers of the federal government. When you go back to the question of President Biden's vaccine mandate for private companies, part of the question there is Congress has the power to regulate and pass laws and regulations for interstate commerce, because Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 says the power to regulate commerce with other nations, with the Indian tribes, and among the states. So our constitutional tradition has said that Congress can only regulate that part of Congress, that part of commerce that is interstate. So the constitutional question about the president's vaccine mandate is, can the president order private companies to do something, even on the local level? So the enumerated powers in federalism are part of the structure, the constitutional structure and environment of our bureaucracy. But the states also have important bureaucratic functions too. So what is the historical evolution of our bureaucracy that Wilson traces in Chapter 11? So in the founding, the hope was that the bureaucracy would be nonpartisan. But then, with the growth of party system, we saw how the rise of parties affected the Electoral College, and affected, obviously, it became part of the internal structure of Congress. But at the first part of the 20th century, the 19th century, in the 1820s and 30s, party politics became part of the administration of government in the executive branch too, through what's called a patronage or spoil system. And this is essentially dominated the way the federal administration worked from the 1820s to the 1880s. So the idea in the spoil system, to the victor belong the spoils of the game or the battle. If you win, you get the dispense of spoils. That the president and members of Congress of that party would then, if they won the election, they would reward people that supported them during the campaign and election with a federal job. And that's why it was called patronage. Now, again, it's one thing to have the entire executive branch work that way. By the Civil War, the size of the bureaucracy of the executive branch had grown to over 100,000 individuals. Imagine how unstable and corrupt. Every time you had a presidential election or the party changed, you have to change the whole structure of government with 100. And then, of course, after the Civil War, with the massive bureaucracies of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Veterans Bureau, which was actually in the Department of the Army in the Civil War, had become a massive bureaucracy, but dealing with veterans, because after all, don't forget, 750,000 soldiers were killed on both sides, and 2 to 3 million soldiers were wounded, and that left a lot of widows and orphans. So the Veterans Bureau, which is still one of the largest bureaucracies in the federal government, grew, but then the Freedmen's Bureau, to supervise the liberated slaves in the former Southern Confederate states. So the problem was, again, you could see how this would work. The party that won the election should be able to say who gets to have federal jobs. The problem was, again, that it began to undermine the very stable operation of government and the non-corrupt end, because people would, of course, do all kinds of things in Congress. Members of Congress, senators, would make corrupt deals to get their supporters appointed to federal office. So this was all changed in the 1883 Pendleton Act, which is often called the Civil Service Act, and that set up the civil service system. And what was the civil service system? Instead of being hired and fired by political party, or whether you supported the president or the president or the political party, the civil service means being hired by merit and fired by cause. Cause meaning not because you were in the wrong party, but because of incompetence or actually malfeasance. So as you're going to see, and this is in addition to the chartograph, the last page of the notes, aside from the blank page to kill trees that I added, this last page of the notes is actually what's called the GS, the General Service Structure, where so what the Civil Service Act did, if you're looking at the chartograph, it removed the vast bulk of federal executive appointees from being hired and fired for political reasons. Now, again, at the top of the pyramid, the 2,000 to 3,000 appointments, those still are political appointments. Those are patronage appointments. And that's why if a Democrat wins the 2024 election, it'll keep much of the same administration that President Biden has put in place. If a Republican wins that, then there'll be new heads of the departments and new undersecretaries and deputy secretaries, and that top layer of administration will change for partisan and political reasons. Again, that's part of the Democratic theory that the president's party and his ability to direct the administration should change with who wins the election and who wins what party wins it. But the vast majority of the executive branch is in the bottom part of that pyramid, and that is under the civil service system, and technically beyond the political control of the president and the president's party. Now, again, the reason it's in a pyramid, again, if you think of an army, the structure of an army, it's hierarchical, it's pyramidical, in the sense that again, you start on the bottom with simple soldiers, infantry, foot soldiers, and then you have ranks like sergeant and lieutenant, and then corporal, and then major, and then colonel, and depending on whether it's admirals in the Navy, etc. And the whole point of that hierarchical arrangement is you have concentrated authority as you go up and specific function as you go down. And so the idea of the civil service system was to create a pool of expertise and stability in the bureaucracy, which ironically also means removing it beyond political control. My mother, may she rest in peace, who passed away from COVID this last February, was a member of the executive branch. She worked for the Department of Defense in the Rock Island Arsenal. It's a military institution in the Quad Cities where I was born and raised. And ran around and swam in the Mississippi. And in the middle of the Mississippi is the Rock Island Arsenal. My mother worked for them, and she met my stepfather there, who was also in the Department of Defense. She was a GS5. If you look on the scale, it's still pretty recent. This is from a couple of years ago. Her salary she was a clerk accountant in the Department of Defense, and her salary was ranked along with her responsibilities. So that's the civil service system. And most of the states, again, have that imitation in their own state bureaucracies. The major change in the civil service system was in the 1980s under the influence of President Carter, which was to separate the Civil Service Commission, which both supervised the merit exams for each office, and also supervised firing to make sure it was nonpartisan. And it was split up into what's called the Merit Protection Board and the Office of Personnel Management. And so one handles hiring and the other one handles firing. And that's the way the federal bureaucracy works today. I already talked about the independent regulatory agencies, which is on page 9, number D. They're technically in and outside of the executive branch because they were created for specialty reasons, because of the complexity of administration, and also to be somewhat beyond political control. With economic expansion, World War I and II, and Depression and the New Deal and Great Society, the size of the government then expanded even more, and that's kind of where we are today. So look at go back to the Fiorina article about the iron triangles, the Washington establishment, special interests, members of Congress that want re-election, and bureaucrats that want to expand their powers. And so, in terms of criticizing and reforms, what are the kinds of criticisms that people make about the bureaucracy? Remember the original discussion of the love-hate relationship? The argument is there's conflict between different agencies because agencies compete with each other for power. There's duplication of effort because oftentimes one agency does the same thing that another one does. Institutional imperialism with different branches. And that's, for instance, even within the Department of Defense. The different armed services compete with each other for money and services and weapons programs. And bureaucratic waste, red tape and waste. What are the kinds of checks on administrative and discretion and bureaucratic control? Well, the president does have a good amount of control. Even, here's an example. When President Reagan, in his first term, according to the contract that all air traffic controllers sign when they are hired under the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administrator, but they sign a contract that they will not strike. But in 1982-83, the air traffic controllers went on strike, and President Reagan fired all of them, thousands of them, and then rehired new ones. He was doing that in terms of his control of the executive branch. So even though air traffic controllers are non-political, he fired them because they violated their contract as part of federal law. What enabled him to fire thousands of air traffic controllers was, it turns out, the FAA had just computerized all of our landing and taking off systems, so that the new hires were able to be trained relatively quickly, and that's why firing thousands of air traffic controllers and hiring new ones didn't shut down our air traffic system in the 1980s. There is congressional oversight, as we saw in Chapter 9, and also discussing in the committee system. Committees and individual members do in fact supervise and help to control and restrain bureaucratic excess. There are legislative processes of appropriation for monies. Every office in the federal government has to lay its case for continued or expanded spending, and of course that's part of the budget that's submitted by the president, etc. So there's also publicity and whistleblowers. The Department of the Veterans Bureau, the Department of Veteran Affairs, went through a series of scandals under President Obama, that their wait time for veterans was excessive, and all this publicity led to certain important reforms in both President Obama and President Trump. So, to come back to the main question, are we ruled by uncheckable bureaucratic masters, which in some partisan circumstances was called the deep state or the swamp? As always, as I point out in my notes, there are more than one side of these issues. The federal bureaucracy is vast, it's difficult to scrutinize and supervise, it does possess massive realms of discretion over growing parts of American life, and as Americans demand more services from their government, they are likely to grow. The federal bureaucracy is likely to grow. Some political scientists and scholars suggest that the overall effect of the expansion of the bureaucracy is to contribute stability and expertise in American government, as opposed to the idiot sitting in the president's in the White House. I'm just kidding. But aren't those unstable and popularly driven politicians the main mechanisms of Republican responsibility? We may complain about politicians, but we do elect them, and they do in fact exercise some control and supervision of this massed bureaucracy. And ultimately, the Congress and the president do possess final authority over the bureaucracy. So my point, the last line in my notes on page 10, is that Americans are likely to be discussing and disputing this question for a long time. So on Monday, we'll begin the last part of the course discussing the judiciary with Hamilton's essay, Federalist 78, from the Federalist Papers.